Hey there, my name's Gary Sims and this is Gary Explains. Now, we heard recently that Intel are shopping around for some RISC-V technology, may even be prepared to spend billions of dollars on getting itself some RISC-V technology. And I have a whole video about that here on this channel. But I thought to myself, wouldn't it be interesting to look at why would Intel want to buy RISC-V? What are the differences between the x86 architecture, which Intel and AMD use to build their processors, and the RISC-V architecture? Well, if you want to find out more, please let me explain. Okay, so let's start with a quick history of x86. Intel was started in 1968 by Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore. Yes, that's Gordon Moore of Moore's Law. And then in 1970, they released their first processor, a 4-bit processor, the 4004, the 4004, launched in 1970. And then by 72 and 74, you get the 8008 and the 8080. And then that was followed by the 8086, which was launched in 1978. And it's that 86-bit that gives us this wording of x86. This series that started here with the 8086. It was a 16-bit CPU. Interestingly enough, Intel actually announced the 8088 in 1979. It's exactly the same as the 8086. However, it has an 8-bit external bus, and that was actually the processor used in the original IBM PC. That was then followed on by the 80186, the 80286 in 1982. 16-bit processor, had the first kind of ideas of virtual addressing that we've got in the modern day x86 processors, had an on-chip MMU, and that really became important when we get the 80386 because it's a 32-bit CPU. It's got this protected mode with the onboard MMU. That was released in 1985 and an incredibly successful processor. And here we are in 1991, and in fact it's the processor that Linus Torvalds used to develop Linux, and of course the rest, as they say, is history. And as all that was going on, also AMD were around. They released the AM386, which was a 386 compatible in 1991. And there's a whole history about the cross-licensing and the deals and the court cases and the more cross-licensing and the victories and the losses between AMD and Intel that gave them, AMD, the right to produce these chips that actually Intel designed back in the late 70s, and now here AMD are producing chips based on that very early stuff here in the 1990s, and of course even through to today, but that isn't our topic for today. And as we carry on, we've got the 486 in 1989 along with compatible chips from AMD, and there was another player that really doesn't exist today, Cyrix. And then, of course, we had the Pentium, which was the 586, but they found out you can't trademark a set of numbers, so they used a word, Pentium, of course, it is for 5, so 586 in 1983. AMD was still producing compatible processors. We'll talk about that in a second. Then it's followed by the Pentium Pro, the Pentium 2, the Pentium 3. That's really the 686 line from 1995 to 1997. The AM5 x86 and the AMD K5 were both processors compatible with the Pentium in 1996 from AMD. By the year 2000, we got the Pentium 4. And then in 2001, Intel tried to escape its x86 legacy, and it launched the doomed 64-bit Itanium processor. Really, the industry was saying at this point, we need backwards compatibility. AMD jumped on board with that and came up with the Athlon 64, which had AMD 64 in it, which is a 64-bit version of the x86 instruction set. Intel then came out with EM64T, which is Intel's version, in 2004. And then collectively, AMD and Intel's version are now known as x86 64 or x64, though some people do insist on calling it AMD 64 in recognition of the fact that AMD were there first. And then to close out our story of x86, of course, in 2005, Apple moved from the PowerPC to Intel processors. In 2006, you have the first Intel Macs that are 64-bit processors. And then, of course, from then until today, you've got the i3, the i5, the i7, the i9, what we're up to 10th, 11th generation that Intel are producing. AMD, of course, is still here. 2017 to present, AMD continues to make compatible and sometimes better processors based on its Zen microarchitecture. AMD also designs custom versions of its x86 64 processors for game console makers like the PlayStation and the Xbox. And then the thing that really rounds off this story is that, of course, in 2020, so in 2005, Apple moved to Intel, and then in 2020, Intel is dropped by Apple as it moved to its own chips based on the ARM architecture. Of course, we have the M1 processor, and I have a video about the M1 performance that is in the MacBook Air here on this channel. So that was x86. What about RISC-V? Well, RISC is this term that was coined by David Patterson. He wrote a very important paper talking about how we need simpler instructions compared to the CISC instructions of the time. And so the RISC-V chip was developed by the University of California, Berkeley, back in the 80s, 1980, 1984. Simple instruction set, fixed length opcode, load store architecture, more register banks. Released in 1981, it had 44,500 transistors and implemented 31 instructions. So that was RISC-V. Then you had RISC-II, which was a follow-on chip that introduced this idea to having condensed or compressed instructions that could fit them into 16 bits. These would then get expanded down the pipeline to 32 bits, but it meant you could get more code into less memory. And then you have RISC-IV and RISC-V, which are not really talked about. They were two processors designed by students who were under the supervision of Patterson, again at the University of California. 1984, 1988, RISC-III and RISC-IV. One was optimized to run Smalltalk, the other was optimized to run Lisp. And then we have a big gap, and not until 2010, this is why RISC-V is a relative newcomer to the game. We're thinking about, Intel back to the 1970s and the 80s. 2010, you've got the initial work on the RISC-V instruction set, again at the University of California. The idea is it's an open source, an open instruction set architecture. ISA stands for instruction set architecture, meaning you just download the document, it's there, there's no license fee to pay. But that doesn't mean it's open source hardware, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Comes in both 32-bit and 64-bit versions, and there is provision for a 128-bit version. Now, all RISC-V CPUs have to implement the base integer ISA, instruction set architecture, and then if it's 32-bit or 64-bit, it calls itself RV, RISC-V 32i for integer, or RISC-V 64i, and that's the very basic the CPU that needs to be implemented, and that's a very simple, it doesn't even have multiply and divide operations inside of it, but every CPU needs to do that. And then there are extensions beyond that which add in extra functionality. Now, RISC-V processors are built by both commercial and non-commercial organizations. So you do get universities that are looking at how you develop processors. They're using RISC-V because they don't have to worry about any licensing issues. And then they publish papers on what they've discovered and teach their students how the fundamentals of processor design. And then there are other companies like Sci-Fi, and there's Andy's Technology, and there are others who develop RISC-V processors, and then they license them to other people who want to put them inside of their products, whether it's an SoC, whether it's some kind of processor for an embedded situation. They use the CPU core, combine that with a GPU and with networking and all the other stuff they need, and then they can get themselves a processor, and they work on a commercial basis, very similar to ARM. They license their cores. You want to have a core, great, you can either pay us a royalty or licensing, whatever the business deal they do is, but money changes hands. So this is, you have to remember, this is a commercial operation that some people misunderstand RISC-V. Now, I do have 4 videos in a series talking about this exact problem here on this channel. I would recommend that you watch them if you need more details. Let's talk quickly about some of those extensions. So there's not even integer multiplication and divide, as I said. So if you want to add that to the CPU, you need to add the M extension that's defined in the RISC-V specification, tells you how to do that. There's also A for atomic instructions, and then you've also got single, double, and quad precision floating point numbers, F, D, and Q. And then there's the C extension, which allows for compressed instructions so that you can get more instructions, more of the program into the memory, and that's very important for embedded applications. Now, of course, you don't want to say I've got an MAFD processor, so they've got G, which is kind of a shorthand form of saying MAFD. Why? Because they assume that lots of advanced processors, particularly ones that can run Linux or something like that, will implement all of those. So a company might say we've got an RV64GC processor. That means it's RISC-V, got the base ISA, 64-bit version. It's got G, which means it's got multiply and division. It's got atomic instructions. It's got floating point in there, both single and double precision. And the C at the end there means it's also got the extension for compressed instructions. And there are other non-ratified extensions like B for bit manipulation, P for packed SIMDs, V for vector operation. Now, some of these are already being put into processors, even though they're not ratified, and the company that make them know that if the ratification process is ratified to the way they made it, that's great. If there are changes, then they will provide patches for operating systems and for compilers so that everything keeps on working. Now, I said we would talk about the fact that it's an open ISA, so you don't need to pay a license for it. You just download the document from the website. Doesn't mean it's open source hardware. Here's the FAQ from RISC-V's website. If a company builds a RISC-V implementation, is it required to release its source code for the RISC-V core? No, the source code can be completely closed. And that's because the ISA is open, but not what you design based around it. That doesn't need to be open. And because of that, it isn't a Linux-like revolution for hardware. It's completely different. So the ISA itself isn't changing every day. There aren't being new things being submitted like there is for Linux, new patches, let's do this, let's do that. The ISA has to be pretty stable, actually, otherwise there's no point having it. So it's not a revolution. It's actually pretty stable and pretty simple. Okay, so this isn't like software where a person can have a compiler, and the compilers are available freely nowadays, and an internet connection. That's it. You can start contributing to open source software. It's hardware. It takes millions of dollars to make a production run of a chip, particularly if you're doing it on a leading node, even an older one, 14 nanometers, 10 nanometers. There's millions of dollars involved. You don't just make chips and just say, oh, ship me some chips, please, and then and the next day. No, this is a big business. So there isn't that same dynamic as open source software. Changes and designs can't simply be tested. Now, of course, you do have FPGAs. They do help, but that isn't the same thing as the leading edge process development that you need for, multi-superscalar, multi-stage pipelines, branch prediction, and all that kind of amazing caches, all that kind of stuff you need. You're not going to be able to do that in this simple way. So it's not a Linux-like revolution at all, because this is hardware. And I've seen people make this statement, and it drives me a bit mad because it's nothing like it, and it's just duping people by saying it is, but it isn't. Okay, the ISA itself is open, and it's not getting changed a lot. Okay, and the hardware that's being made is generally it's all closed, and occasionally there's some open stuff. But even then, if it's open, I'm not going to go off and order 100 chips and get them manufactured and then shipped to my house. It's not going to happen like that. So please stop calling it a Linux-like revolution for hardware. Okay, so let's look at some of the differences. So x86, 8664 is the architecture used by Intel and AMD. It's defined via a love-hate relationship between Intel and AMD. As I've said, there was, AMD 64, which was not what Intel wanted, and then Intel jumped on board, and then you've got the whole thing with 3D Now and MMX and SSS, and it's just, there's so much stuff, lots of court cases, lots of cross-licensing that goes on. So it's a very different relationship than RISC-V, which is an architecture governed by the non-profit RISC-V International. Now, Intel designs its own CPUs and manufactures its own CPUs. That's one of the things about it. It's a company that's got manufacturing and design, so it has its own fabrication plants. Whereas AMD only does the design, and then it uses a third party like TSMC or Samsung Semiconductor to do the fabrication. And because of that, at the present time, TSMC and Samsung are doing better at fabrication. Intel is very aware of this. It's a big ticket item for them. They're stuck on 10 nanometers. Now, of course, there is a discussion about the relative densities of TSMC's, let's say, 7 nanometer compared to Intel's 10 nanometer, but Intel are very much aware they're stuck, whereas the other companies are forging ahead, and they're already now talking about 3 nanometer chips. Now, the other players involved in this are companies like Sci5, Andes Technology. They design RISC-V CPU cores, and then they license them to other people who then get those chips made, and they may choose to use TSMC or someone else like that. So these are the different players in those two different markets. Now, only Intel and AMD make x64 processors. That's an important thing to note. Okay, there is a joint venture that's going on in China that makes an x86 64 compatible processor, but that's mainly for the Chinese market. Whereas in the RISC-V domain, anybody can make a chip. So Sci5, Andes Technology we talked about. Some companies design their own RISC-V CPU core. So Western Digital, NVIDIA, in fact, they all use their own ones because they wanted a microprocessor inside of the hard disk, inside of the GPU, and they said, well, let's just design our own. We can use RISC-V royalty-free, and it's good. It's fairly simple, probably, so not too complicated, not multi this and advanced that and super scalar, who knows what, and that works for them. So Only Intel and AMD make x86, excluding China, whereas lots of people can make RISC-V cores. And of course, the big difference is x86-64 is CISC, complex instruction set computing, and RISC-V is obviously RISC, the whole reason why RISC exists, the paper written by Patterson defining RISC and why it was different and important compared to CISC. CISC tries to do more in one instruction, so complex multi-stage instructions make the CPU more like the software. Memory was expensive and historically it was slow. And also you have variable length instructions, so when you start reading in the instruction, you could read up to 15 bytes in before you get to the end of the instruction. You don't know that at the beginning. That makes it more complex, has the advantages because you've got this big instruction that's come in, lots of things it can do, but it means that reading it in and then executing it is more complicated. RISC tries to do things much simpler. One thing per instruction. Simpler instructions, one instruction per cycle was the idea way back in the day. That's no longer true, of course, nowadays. Fixed instruction sizes and load store architecture never works directly on the memory. What do I mean by that? Well, if you wanted to add 1, let's say, to the contents of whatever is in memory address hex 100, in RISC that's 3 instructions. You have to load the contents of memory address hex 100 into register R1, let's say. You then need to add 1 to R1, and then you need to write it back to that memory location. Now, on a CISC instruction computer, you would just say add 1 to whatever is in address hex 100. It would go ahead and work out how to do that for you. Now, since the Pentium Pro, x86 instructions are actually turned into micro ops, which are much more like RISC type things. So a complex instruction like add 1 to the memory, whatever's in the memory address of hex 100, gets converted into 3 micro-ops. Load, add, and then store again, and the processor then treats those down the pipeline to actually do that stuff. But that extra logic for having to convert from CISC to RISC needs more power, and it generates more heat, and that's one of the reasons why Intel was never quite so successful in the smartphone market, although it did try. But when it comes in terms of performance, we have to recognize, and this isn't even debatable, this is not like my opinion, but it's just absolutely the latest RISC-V CPUs. If you take something from a company like Sci5, are generations behind the best that you can get from Intel and AMD. It's not even a discussion, as I said, it's just a fact. I would say they're 10 years behind. And of course, the problem is for the RISC-V makers is that every year they need to make a new chip that is not only better than last year's chip, but it's better relative to what Intel and AMD are making. So if they're 10 years behind, they need to catch up and make a chip that's a bit more better so that it's got greater performance growth, greater efficiency growth, greater cost growth than what's coming from Intel and AMD. So it's next year it's 9 years behind, then it's 8 years behind, and then it's 7, and that's a long, hard slug, a long, hard journey to do that repeatedly year after year after year to catch up with what they're doing. And that's why I don't think you're going to see any decent performance from RISC-V CPUs for at least a decade. And it's also worth mentioning OS support. Linux works on 32-bit and 64-bit Intel, AMD, and RISC-V. So RISC-V is mainly supported by Linux. Android does not support officially RISC-V because it does support x86. I'm sure there have been some porting exercises. Android, of course, is based on Linux, so it should work, but it's not officially supported by Google. Windows, of course, runs on x86. Everyone knows that. It also runs now on ARM, but it doesn't run on RISC-V, and I can't see that happening in the next decade. Mac OS still currently runs on x86, of course, because Intel has only just been dropped by Apple, so Intel are still available. They could probably still even buy an Intel Mac today if you went and tried. But there's no reason why it's ever going to run on RISC-V. Again, a decade plus before we could even think, ask the question, is that going to happen? And then Chrome OS doesn't officially support RISC-V. Again, Chrome OS is based on Linux. Chrome is also available for Linux. There's no reason why it technically couldn't work. I'm sure there's been some porting exercises, but again, it's not officially supported at the moment. So really, if you're using a RISC-V processor, your only real choice is Linux at the moment. And it's also worth talking about the dangers of RISC-V forking, because RISC-V allows these extensions, which means someone can implement the base ICE and then they can implement their other things on top, and the company's already doing this. So, for example, Andes Technology designs RISC-V CPUs, and they have the Andes extended instructions, which are exclusive performance and functionality enhancements available for those CPUs. So, if you get a big company that adds in its own extension, then if you don't support that extension, you become irrelevant. And of course, this is what happened in the x86 field. You've got 3D Now and MMX and AVX and SSE and all this long history. And of course, AMD 64 compared to the 32-bit version, you either implement this or die. So imagine if Intel did buy a company like Sci5 and then added its own extensions to RISC-V. It doesn't matter that RISC-V is open, you become irrelevant the moment you don't support what the leader is supporting because of the sheer size of that company. So it's a real danger, even though, of course, the RISC-V people will try to downplay that. It is actually a real danger. So what's going to happen in the future? Well, x86 isn't going to lose its top spot anytime soon. ARM-based processors are really the greatest threat to x86 at the moment. Of course, we've got ARM-based M1 Max now. There's ARM-based processors moving their way into the server area. Intel needs to move past 10 nanometers. Intel knows that. It's got plans to do that, but it needs to happen. AMD will continue to benefit from the process node improvements of TSMC. But as we know, Intel is shopping around for some RISC-V tech. Intel is interested in RISC-V for its XPU vision. The X there standing for whatever letter you want to put in. CPU, GPU, DPU, IPU, whatever it is, NPU. And RISC-V for IPUs for machine learning could be a benefit rather than trying to take, like Intel did, they tried to take the Pentium core and clock it down to 30 megahertz and turn that into a microcontroller. It didn't work. And it'd be better to start with a simple processor like the RISC-V, just 31, but I think about 40 something instructions. It was 31 for the original RISC-1 processor, 40 something instructions, and you can start to build things, and then you can add your own extensions in the hardware to do IPU and machine learning, whatever you want, and it's all there built into the way that RISC-V is designed. So quite a powerful proposition for a big chip company like Intel. Now I've got a whole video about this if you want to go and watch that. It's about my my video of how my analysis of Intel trying to buy Sci5 for $2 billion. On the RISC-V, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to continue to see RISC-V growth in the microcontroller market because microcontrollers are much, much simpler. But we're still waiting for a popular and prevalent RISC-V Arduino rival. Of course, there are some RISC-V microprocessors out there. But we're waiting for that one that, you know, it's just as popular as Arduino. You've got the RISC-V Beagle board coming up, the Beagle 5, but that won't rival the Raspberry Pi 4 in terms of cost or in terms of performance. It's already starting from a disadvantage before it comes out. It'll be more expensive and won't be as fast. We will continue to see the launch of RISC-V processors that are capable of running Linux. They will be way behind the offerings from x86 and from Intel and from AMD. Some of them will fail, and they will fail not because of RISC-V, but because of the microarchitecture, because it's hard to build a chip that is both has the performance and the efficiency and the cost. Okay, and to do that from a small company and then leap into something everyone goes, wow, that's a chip we need to use. So not because of RISC-V per se, but because it's hard. And there are only a few companies in the world that are managing to make higher performance, efficient and cost-effective processors. Intel, ARM, Apple, those kind of people are doing this, and it will be hard for RISC-V to get in there and do that. My name is Gary Sims. This is Gary Explains. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Okay, that's it. I'll see you in the next one.